Alright guys, I'm here back with a new video, and in this video, I'm back with another review for a challenge season, this being the Challenge World Championship, the culmination of 4 other spin-off challenge seasons. Now the best from those seasons face off against each other, and the season turns out to be just kind of fine. Now I will say I probably like this more than the recent seasons of the main series, though really at the end of the day, again, it was largely just okay. Now obviously it is a very cool concept. I mean, having these 4 shows lead up to essentially a crossover, or also mixing in challenge legends from the original show and having them all face off against each other is a really cool concept. How I do feel like the execution here was just very weird, which we'll obviously get to in the review. But again, it's a purely fine season here. It's the one that I don't have overtly negative opinions on, even though there are some dumb production decisions along the way. But it is certainly a letdown considering the scale of this season, and it feeling like a season that should have been the season to end all seasons, feeling like this winners at war style season for the challenge, and under that lens it does come off as a bit disappointing. But either way, I'll be running through my full thoughts on the season, talking about from beginning to end, and let's start off with episode 1, where right away we do see the global players enter first, these obviously being players from the Challenge USA, Australia, UK, and Argentina, which, I mean, the inclusion of Argentina here just feels really random to me. Not that Argentina shouldn't have its own challenge season, but for, again, 3 native English-speaking countries to be on the same season as people from a Spanish-speaking country obviously gives those people a massive disadvantage. And really, the Argentinians on this season were largely screwed over, again, obviously having the language barrier to begin with, but also beyond that, were the last people to film their season, meaning their season had literally just ended filming at the time that this started filming, meaning that they were still injured from their respective seasons, but also even beyond that, they couldn't even get the top people from their original season, where the winner and the runner-up of their original season could not make it for this season. Instead, we're just getting this random mix mash of 4 Argentinian competitors, and it really just feels like a mess. And really, from a production standpoint, the entire World Championship just feels like a mess. Well, obviously, Argentina has those issues. Obviously, we even look back at something like UK, which had an extremely short season, which that season largely felt like it was made solely to still have this World Championship season later on. Australia obviously completely bombed in the ratings, and USA didn't do the greatest either, with the final of USA obviously being widely noted as a low point for challenge production. So really just all of this felt like a mess to begin with, and to be fair, the season probably ends up being better than what it should have been considering how much of a mess this was, even though it does get off to a slow start here. But here we end up seeing all 4 hosts there, which makes you think that they're going to be there the entire season, but they aren't, and TJ's the only one that's consistently there. But anyway, we get introduced to a couple of the global players, first up being Claudia from Argentina, and I mean right away, again, you can tell how much they're going to struggle with the language barrier there, their accents being pretty thick. And I love how, like, with Rodri, they even bother making him try to speak in English and just let him speak in Spanish, which I don't get why they just didn't let them speak in Spanish in the confessional. I feel like that would have been perfectly fine, especially because you're already doing it for Rodri. But either way, the other one we get introduced to in the intro here ends up being Zara, which is really random considering how invisible she was in the Challenge UK. So I did find it funny how she had a much bigger edit on this season than she did her first time around. But either way, we follow this up with the challenge legends arriving. These challenge legends like Nelson and Kellyanne and Naya and even Theo, who I thought was cool to have back here, but why on a World Championship season? And really from a broader standpoint, looking at the cast here, well, it is a very impressive cast on paper, with obviously a wide range of winners, both from the OG show, but then also from the spin-offs. It still kind of underwhelms me that they didn't just go all in on this winner theme, where I very much do feel like this could have been this Winners at War, this truly legendary winner season that instead ends up being this kind of mix mash of random people from these different countries, where again we have certain people from the OG show that had never won there and don't even have the biggest legacies in the world, while looking at the global side of things, I mean the US, Australia, and UK all have 2 winners and 2 non-winners, while Argentina doesn't have any winners. So it's like, I don't know what they were doing. It just feels like this very random last second put together cast that really makes this entire thing feel like more of a mess. But anyway, we follow this up with us finding out that the legends are not going to do anything just yet, but instead they're going to watch as the global players will end up participating in a qualifier, which I kind of liked in concept. I mean, this very much felt like Fresh Meat, where in Fresh Meat they had to do these trials and they would end up using those stats to allow the legends pick their partners. But strangely here, the global players end up picking anyway, which kind of made that less impactful, though this obviously did determine the order of how they picked. But again, like the qualifier here was an interesting concept. I just feel like it went on for way too long. And this took up a bulk of this first episode, and it really just started to drag, where we just had checkpoint after checkpoint after checkpoint. Though here we obviously get introduced to a bulk of the players as we go through, with me having already obviously known a majority of them from their original shows, where at the time that this aired, the only one I hadn't watched yet was Argentina, which ironically I didn't get to watch until after most of the Argentina people were gone, which is funny. Though again, a lot of these confessionals are also foreshadowing, with Bananas talking about wanting to be on Team USA and Amber saying Troy has heart, and a lot of these other lines that just clearly lead up to the eventual pairings. Also setting up certain storylines like Theo and Kaz, who were exes that ended up repairing their relationship on this season. We get the setup of this rift between the Australians, with Emily not trusting Kiki, and that really ends up bloating the length of this challenge. Though there were some humorous things about this challenge, particularly Mark, the host from Challenge UK, really propping up Tristan here and really encouraging him, clearly having favoritism there, only for Tristan to then come in last. With Grant surprisingly coming out and winning here, which was a shock considering he is one of the players that's performed the worst on their original season. I did find the final checkpoint here to be kind of strange, where he had to lift this really heavy flagpole, and we see Emily and Sarah just suck at this somehow and go from first and second to towards the bottom of the pack out of nowhere. And we also see Troy really struggle with it, despite being a top contender at the very beginning, which that seemed to be due to size, which was kind of just unfair to him. But anyway, on the women's side of things, we obviously see Zara win here, as kind of set up by her earlier confessional, while we have Claudia coming in last, which was a bit of a shame considering she was doing pretty well for a lot of it and then just kind of fell out of it at the puzzle. But this is where we get the reveal that Tristan and Claudia, having come in last, are now going into the arena, where essentially we're going to play out an entire round of gameplay using just the global players. To our following this round, we will then have them paired up with the legends, which I guess I might as well talk about the overall format of the show at this point, which I really don't like. It is so strange to me that the entire lead up to this world championship had the utilization of the algorithm, this constantly changing format where you would change your partner every round. However, when we get the World Championship, they change it to where you stick with your partner the entire season, which seems to completely go against what the seasons leading up to this were comprised of. But even beyond that, for a World Championship season, this is just kind of lame. That a season that is essentially declaring the best of the best is going to be determined by who you pick as your partner at the very beginning. Again, I just find it very disappointing that that's the approach they took with this season. I feel like this should have been the season to declare the best of all time, to have this more like free agent style format where you have to prove that you're the best as an individual, and instead we have this all based around these initial teams. Though another bad aspect of this format is the fact that because these pairs are tied together, that really ends up stifling a lot of the gameplay, because no matter what, a newbie is going to be paired up with a vet that has a lot of pre-existing relationships. And with a lot of the players on this season caring more about their pre-existing relationships and how that will affect them on future seasons than actually trying to win this specific game, it does lead to a lot of the gameplay being stifled from the newbies, or them not being really able to play to the most of their potential. But either way, following this, we do get obviously the rival in the house, which I will say throughout this entire sequence, I did find it strange how the only person to not get a confessional here was Jordan, who is obviously the eventual winner, which I don't know why they made that choice. But again, a lot of setup to the eventual choices of teams, where we obviously see these later pairings bonding for the first time, which is just blatantly telling us who's going to be paired up with who. But we do see some alliances forming here, which really a lot of the alliances early on here seem to be based around country, which is just kind of dull, to be honest, though again makes a lot of sense when you're in the game. Obviously it just becomes a very easy way to get these numbers together, especially when if you come in with your country, you're more than likely going to stick with your country for at least the short term. However, again, it doesn't lead to interesting TV, and I think that's another flaw in the format here, is how two countries can essentially get together and already hold the majority of the numbers. And we see that happen here in Nathan forming an alliance between Australia and UK, which, I mean, this alliance doesn't really last long. And we follow this up with Nathan saying that he feels bad for Tristan, who fell at the first hurdle, which obviously later ends up being ironic. But also here we get the setup of the Sarah and Emily relationship, which ends up being a pretty important one moving forward, which ends up leading to USA and Australia working together. But all of this is essentially leaving Argentina out of it, which again just feels so unfair to Argentinians who never felt like they had a true shot on this season. Where right away we do see Rodri and Hui being the targets, with there being talk of going one country at a time, which just leads to kind of a boring early game here of just the Argentinians being targeted. However, we do get a sliver of intrigue here from the reveal that Sarah wants to keep the Argentinians around to keep them as numbers, while also not liking Kaz and Zara, leading us to a very interesting vote here, though beforehand TJ ends up revealing that Nathan has been DQ'd from the game, which really just ends up being super abrupt, but because that Tristan is now safe and doesn't have to go into elimination, but Claudia still has to, and this is where we get the nomination format of the season, where we find out that obviously last place will automatically go in, while the remaining players that aren't the winners will end up voting for 2 players to go into the elimination, while the winners will end up selecting one of those 2. A format that I don't particularly like either. Again, this is another thing that just benefits the majority alliance. It allows the majority to hand pick 2 people for the winner to pick between. And while we still have the last place finisher in a daily going in, which is an aspect I've always liked, or at least leads to more variety in who goes in, I think the voting in process here essentially ends up being a neutered down version of a more ideal format of just having the daily winners pick who goes in. But right away we do see some votes going to Argentinians until we find out that USA has actually flipped the vote onto Kaz and Kiki. Kaz is their actual target, and Kiki just because, I guess, which just ends up being a really strange aspect of this vote, where we get the reveal that Emily gave the go-ahead to put Kiki into elimination because she wanted to see what the tiebreaker was, as Grant and Zara would have never agreed in either of the 2 going in, which is just a weird rationale here to risk putting Kiki in. Now again, there weren't really any other options, as obviously Sarah and Emily aren't going to put themselves. They can't put in Justine, who's a number for them, and also Hui they're looking at as a number for them. So it's like, again, there's not many options, but this did seem like a weird rationale. But I will say I did really like that the likes of Sarah and Danny across the season do end up playing really hard. I mean, while they do get some criticism online for how they acted, I did like that they stood up for their own games, that they do play this game in a similar way to how they would play Survivor, and that is something I did greatly respect from them. But obviously we do get a tiebreaker here, which for some reason they decide to give Zara the deciding vote, because this is a women's elimination, which made no real sense, but fine, I guess. And through that, Kiki ends up going in, which obviously means that this plan completely backfired on Emily, which is kind of the issue with it to begin with. Though the elimination ends up being pole wrestled, during which it never felt like Claudia really had a shot against Kiki, with Kiki really decimating her there, winning 3-0. And you get this like notable moment of Kiki doing a split in the middle of the match, which is kind of an interesting technique, but either way, Kiki easily wins here, with the episode ending with the players being about to pick their pairs. Before moving on, let's talk about the 2 booted players here. Starting off with Nathan, who obviously just sucks to see him get taken out in the way that he does. Really ends up having a really brief stint on this season. Nathan's someone I did like while watching Challenge UK, and I wouldn't mind him later appearing on the challenge moving forward. But obviously with this season in particular, there isn't much to say. But then we got Claudia, who watching Challenge Argentina, I also liked. I feel like she didn't get much to do on this season, obviously. I never felt like she was really going to be able to hold her own against many of the other women of this cast, though she's still a likable enough presence and one that was a decent casting choice for this season. Remember episode 2, where here we get the partner pick, with obviously the global players picking their partners. And we did get some surprise first picks in my eyes, where Grant ends up picking Janae, who is obviously a great pick. Though surprised she was picked over the likes of a Tori or a Casey, who I think would have been more traditional picks there. Also, Zara ends up picking Wes, which is just another pretty strange one. Again, playing into Wes's overall strategy on most of his seasons now of picking up a protege, and Zara ends up being his for this season, which I did really like their dynamic on this season. It bringing out a lot more personality from Zara, who I again felt like was kind of boring on her first season. But in other words, we did get more traditional picks with Ben picking Casey, Kaz picking Jordan, Annie picking Tori, and all the standard picks there. Though I will say, I was surprised to see Theo get as passed over as he was, with him being the penultimate pick, which is kind of insane, which leads to him being paired up with Sarah, which was a pretty powerful duo. And all this ends up with Kellyanne and Nelson being the last picks, kind of as expected. But following this, we do get the start of another of the more interesting storylines on this season that they really ham up in these first few episodes, that being the Kellyanne versus Janae relationship, where despite the two being friends in the outside world, Janae clearly doesn't trust Kellyanne, which leads to this interesting meltdown of their relationship in the following episodes. Then we get to the daily, which ends up being a pretty physical one that involves carrying a chain over to a puzzle, and we do see the pair of Grant and Janae come off really strong here, winning it here, while Nelson and Hui end up in last, really setting up this further downfall for the Argentinians here, with there being instant talk about just throwing in Benha and Jody as another Argentinian pair, and that way they guarantee an Argentinian goes home, and again, it's just kind of boring gameplay. Though here we do see the paranoia from Kellyanne really get to her, which ends up being a pretty humorous sequence of events, with her literally talking about targeting USA while Tori is in the room, who's obviously partnered with Danny. We see her like frantically running around, campaigning, forgetting people's names. Again, it's a really fun sequence. Though this does further put the target on Kellyanne's back, where by the time we get to nominations, it obviously ends up being Jody and Benha and Kellyanne and Tristan. And we end this episode on a very strange cliffhanger after this strange Janae-Kellyanne conversation, where Janae talks about how she doesn't know what's going to happen, and in the confessional talks about wanting Kellyanne out of the game, which just ends up being weird that we end on a cliffhanger here, where the first two episodes here end up coming out on the same day, which again just feels weird they released the second episode just to cliffhanger us anyway, with this entire round of gameplay taking place over the course of 2 episodes for some reason. But either way, it does take us to episode 3, where we get more of the Janae-Kellyanne relationship, which again ends up being a major focus of this episode, because it really felt like there wasn't that much else going on throughout this stretch of the season. Though again, it becomes very obvious that Kellyanne is eventually going to be voted in, with Grant seeming to be very anti-Kellyanne and Janae just being incommittal to her anyway. Though throughout this episode, we do get a decent amount of character moments that are kind of nice to see. Moments like Nelson and Hui bonding over talking about what they would do with the money. We get this storyline about Benha trying to learn the game, essentially. And we later see him have a conversation with Bananas and him trying to learn the game from him, which is kind of funny considering he later plays into Bananas' downfall. We have Tori perfectly outlining why she shouldn't be on the show, where they're talking about not wanting to mess up relationships for future seasons, which really just shows you the entire issue of Modern Challenge, and that so many of the people that are currently being cast are the same people to where they're so worried about future seasons that they're not willing to turn against their own. And they just play a really boring strategy, which again, not faulting them for playing that strategy. It is the optimal strategy for them, but it is also so boring to watch to where I condemn the producers for continuing to cast these people. This does lead to the first split between the Danny-Tori relationship, and we do see him and Sarah talk about how they don't trust any of the legends, which obviously foreshadows their later gameplay. Following this, we get a weird montage of Ben cleaning the house and hiding his stuff so he doesn't have to do the others' dishes, which is just a weird segment to have on the show. We once again get a checkup with Kaz and Theo. We get more of the Tori-Jordan relationship, which is still boring. But anyway, it takes us to the elimination, where, what do you know? Janae and Grant vote in Kellyanne and Tristan. What a shocker. Though, here we do get a really fun elimination, where Nelson and Hui just suck so bad. Particularly Nelson, where they have to swing their partners to knock over these puzzle pieces, and Nelson would just continuously stop her momentum, which it was funny to see how much the show hammed this up and how much of a dodo edit they gave to Nelson over this. And the entire challenge ends with Nelson only having one piece, a piece that he himself didn't even knock over. So again, it was kind of a humorous storyline there, but the episode doesn't end there. We continue on with more Kellyanne-Janae relationship, with us seeing Kellyanne go on this massive rant, only for Grant to walk into the room and tell them directly that he thought they were going home, which is just such a dickish thing to say, but that's Grant for you. But we have this awkwardness between Kellyanne and Janae, where they sit in the room in silence, only to lead up to a fight, which ends up being another cliffhanger for some reason, because again, they really need to make a meal out of this. But before moving on, let's talk about the eliminated players, that being Hui and Nelson, who had a fun dynamic on this season. Again, I did like their playful energy, though realistically, both of them were two of the more questionable casting choices on this season. Hui, she was literally a third boot in Argentina, and for her to come back here does feel kind of ridiculous, though again, considering the issues they had with finding people, it makes sense. And then we also got Nelson, who is probably one of the biggest question marks from a legend standpoint. But again, Nelson's a fine, affable guy. I don't mind Nelson on the challenge. I would rather have Nelson back than the likes of Tori and Casey. Though at the same time, it's like he clearly didn't stand a chance on this season. He was clearly outclassed here. But still, I feel like that actually brought an interesting dynamic to his casting here and how outclassed he was, with him recognizing that, which I thought was kind of interesting to see. But either way, with that, we move on to episode 4, where we get more talk about the Kellyanne Janae fight, because obviously. But it's also here where Wes and Zara start to get more content, which makes you think they're either going to win a daily or go into elimination, and what do you know, they later win the daily. Before that, we do get some interesting character moments, like Rodri finally getting some content over him teaching Tori salsa dancing. We also see Naya and Jordan's relationship, which has some nice content for Naya, with her talking about the reason why she wasn't on the Challenge 38 and that she needed to make some life changes, which was nice to see from her, though at the same time, this Rodri-Naya content also made it clear that they were probably going to elimination. But with that, we do finally get to the daily, which for some reason, Bryony Dawson, the host of Challenge Australia, is there, and they end up later hosting the elimination as well, which was nice to see this inclusion of the global hosts, though I do wish they played a bigger role on the season. But we do get an interesting daily here, one that probably doesn't work out that well in practicality most of the time, where we had this massive tunnel that the players had to run through, and this gate on the other side that would start closing, and they had to cross over before the gate fully closed, and they would run back and forth with people being eliminated along the way. And I did feel like this could have been fun, though the actual practicality of it was not as interesting, where again, it's very prone to injury with everyone being clumped together, and we do see Rodri re-injure himself during this. We also get this very wonky ending to the challenge where Wes ends up winning because he slides under the gate. However, that's something that Jody had tried to do earlier and got DQ'd for doing the same thing. So again, it felt very wonky rule-wise, but either way, Wes ends up winning here, while Rodri and Naya are declared the losers because they were at the back of the pack during the first round, which felt very lame. I mean, 100% what should have determined the losers was them just running it again with all the first eliminees, though, again, this is the challenge production for you, so obviously they went the worst possible outcome. And with that, again, Argentina is now in danger. And with Rodri being injured at the same time, it became very clear that Rodri and Naya were going home here. But this is where we do see the alliance between Danny, Sarah, Grant, and Emily start to form, with them having planned on taking out Wes or Jordan, with now Jordan being their main priority. Which, I mean, despite this alliance outside Danny not being particularly likable, I did like the fact that they were going against the vets, that they were trying to make these moves that made for fun TV here, and we do see Danny trying to campaign against Jordan despite Tori being his partner, which is all really funny, though we also get some more frustration from Darrell talking about not wanting to go through this because he doesn't want to piss people off, which is just boring. Again, like, why are we casting Darrell all the time? Where it seems like Darrell's only willing to make a move at a situation where he's in direct danger, which again is just not interesting TV. But either way, Jody and Benha, Kellyanne and Tristan are voted in as expected, which is just still boring. But we get to the elimination where obviously Benha and Jody are voted in to guarantee someone from Argentina is going home, because obviously. And this elimination really does not end up being that interesting as well, considering Rodri's injury and how clear it felt like they were eventually going home, to where Jody and Benha obviously win here, leaving Benha now as the only Argentinian left in the game, which is pretty insane considering we're only a third of the way through the season. But with that, let's talk about the Boots and Rodri and Naya, who really just didn't have that much of a role on this season, and they both were kind of just there until this Boot episode here. Now Rodri, he was already injured, plus also him having the language barrier and seeming to be the Argentinian of the bunch that didn't know English seemingly at all, that seemed to limit his screen time here, though I did like him on Challenge Argentina. I thought he had a fun energy there, and considering his strength and challenges there as well, again, he was a solid pick for this cast. Just wish that, again, they gave him more time to heal from his injuries, and also just wish the language barrier didn't have to play a factor. Now Naya, nice bit of character development with her. They're seeming to want to change her ways, and overall I did feel like she came off pretty likable on this season, but again, didn't really get that much to do. Well, then we move on to episode 5, where I feel like this is where the season starts to pick up a bit, with obviously the stopping of this pagonging for the Argentinians, though right away we do start it off with some personal content for Zara, and her also talking about her being a target due to her being partnered up with Wes, which obviously sets up that they're potentially going home. But also we get to see more drama between Grant and Emily and Kiki, with Kiki being upset at being left out of the strategy talks and talking about not necessarily working with Australia moving forward, even though she does for this round. But this is followed by Wes and Jordan talking about targeting the Australians, during which we have this really funny confessional of me of Jordan being all in on targeting Yes and Emily, and Kaz is just there in the confessional sitting next to him, having like no response, which is just funny, as that kind of just describes Kaz's role on the season at this point of just being there. But following this, we also get to see the split between Team USA as well, with talk about Ben being on the outside of that alliance, with each of the other US players having issues with him, which obviously plays into a later deliberation. But here we do get a daily, one that is a pretty notable one, as it was in the trailers. I did think it at least looked cool visually, of the players being spun around in circles and have to toss these rings to one another and then into the bin. And again, it was a cool challenge visually, though didn't really do too much for me outside that, though we do get them having to drink a gross smoothie before doing it, during which Wes, in his brilliant wisdom, decides to take the penalty for not drinking it, which just seemed really dumb. However, the thing that I find even dumber is that they get 5 points knocked against them for doing this, while later we see Amber and Troy also have to take a penalty, to which they get 7 points deducted, which it's like, why? Like, none of this makes sense. And we also see Sarah not finishing hers, but only get a 2-point penalty. Like, all this felt extremely arbitrary. And once again, just felt like production making some wonky rulings there. By the way, Kiki and Justine both doing really well for their partnerships, though Kiki and Darrell end up winning the daily here, while Wes and Zara end up being in last. Either way, with Wes now going to elimination, we obviously have the US-Australia Alliance wanting to target Jordan, with Danny now telling Ben the plan on targeting Jordan, only for Ben to then decide to not do it and decide to target 2 Australians instead, which I don't get from Ben's perspective. I understand that he doesn't trust the US team at this point, but what is Jordan doing for Ben? And instead, we have Ben actively wanting to target the Australians, with him trying to blatantly flip Troy and Amber into voting against their fellow Australians, which was just very sloppy play there. By the way, the votes end up being tied up, coming into the final vote, that being Danny and Tori, who get into this massive argument over Danny wanting to vote in Jordan, while obviously Tori doesn't. And this was a pretty great back and forth here. I did find this to be pretty fun to see someone finally challenge Tori here, and him not going to save Jordan, which again, like you can say is suboptimal play 100%, as obviously Jordan is someone that is not going to get rid of Danny here due to his connection with Tori, though at the same time, I do think Jordan is such a big threat in the final that I can understand why you would want him out here. I do think it is a move that probably is a bit too early to be attempting to make, though also it's like the further Jordan gets, probably the harder it is to get him out anyway, due to his other ingrained allies. That I can see fault with making this move this early, though I personally still think going for it isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, especially considering it gains him loyalty with Grant, as again he had made a promise to Grant that he wasn't going to send him in. And really, we do see the vets being really petulant here, with Jordan and Bananas really being upset here. Like, Bananas freaking out about them making burn votes, when it's like we literally saw the vets throwing burn votes earlier in the season. So again, this was all stupid. But following this, we get more of the Emily-Kiki rivalry here, with Kiki not trusting Emily and Grant and talking about potentially putting them in, during which we do get a funny scene of Emily and Sarah mocking Jordan and Tori's engagement, which was funny. By the way, the episode does end with us getting to the elimination, where we get the reveal that the ramifications of a stalemate are that the winners get the sole vote, which is not that much of a punishment there. It's really just making the format what it probably should have been to begin with. By the way, in the following episode, obviously Kiki and Darrell don't end up voting in Australian, and instead vote in Ben and Casey, which was just kind of out of left field, as we've never seen Kiki and Darrell talk about Ben and Casey before, though we do get a flashback to the Australians talking about targeting Ben, or him having turned against USA, which fine, I guess, though this ends up being a challenge that does greatly disfavor Wes and Zara, with one of the players having to hold up weights while the other one has to do math, something that both things Zara is not particularly great at, leading to Wes and Zara's loss here. But with that, let's talk about Wes and Zara, who were really fun on this season. I did like their dynamic. Obviously, Wes is just Wes. He's going to be the same character every time. Though I do think Wes really brought out a fun character out of Zara, who again was kind of boring on Challenge UK. Where I did think him teaching her to be a more cutthroat player was a pretty interesting dynamic to watch. And I think Zara really proved herself as a really solid competitor on this season. Mind you, one that is obviously flawed. Again, she isn't the greatest at mental challenges and isn't the strongest at brute strength, though the fact that she did come in first in that qualifier is definitely very impressive. And them being taken out here just felt like it was due to Wes's dumb decision at the Daily. Well, with that, let's move back to episode 6. Where after returning to the house, we do get more of this fracturing between the Australians. We talk about how close Emily and Sarah are, and Troy and Amber talking about having to look out for their own best interests, which doesn't end up mattering too much in this episode because we get to the Daily, where it ends up being this notable challenge of the players having to jump from a tall platform onto an inflatable one that launches their partners in the air to where they have to cross over some bars, which again is a cool visual challenge, and seeing the players being launched there. And we do get some impressive performances here, with Kellyanne and Tristan ending up winning the Daily here, which was a surprise, along with Emily really showcasing her swimming ability and her going back to help Wes during it, though the losers of this challenge end up being Grant and Janae, with a lot of that coming from the fact that Grant literally missed the entire platform, which just feels like, again, incompetence from production. It once again feels like a situation where this is a challenge that seems so primed for an injury, where if it was that easy for you to miss the platform and injure yourself on the way down, this shouldn't have been a challenge to begin with. Either just make the platform wider so that someone can't fall off the side like Grant did, or just don't do a challenge this prone to injury. And through that, we do see Grant being taken out by medical, with him having injured his leg, to which it was obviously going to lead to his later DQ, though we do continue on with the episode as if nothing happened, with TJ even telling the players before they leave that make sure there's no stalemates this time, which even feels like production is trying to tell the players to play in a very boring way, like, hey, make sure you get a big majority vote. I found that kind of annoying, but either way, we get to the talk about the vote, where we get this great scene of Danny and Sarah talking to Tori and Bananas, and to me, this really just came off as Bananas coming off as an ass here, with him saying that's a mistake to look too far forward, which is obviously the thing you say when you're in a good standing if no one looks too far forward. Well, he also just comes off as extremely condescending here and talking about how they don't know what they're doing because they've only played one season. But again, I did love that Sarah fought back here. For again, I'm not the biggest Sarah Lacina fan in the world, but let's see Sarah getting upset saying you're not going to talk to me this way, and calls him out when he just decides to leave the conversation. All ends up being pretty fun. But either way, most of the house seems to want to vote in Emily and Yes, as obviously Grant and Janae's closest allies, during which we finally get the payoff for the fractures within the Australians, with Amber and Troy voting in Emily and Yes, which they're obviously shocked by. This also leads to some fun fighting at the table, with Tori and Danny wanting to vote last as they don't know what they're doing, which I will say, this did seem kind of wonky. That this is literally a thing you could do. You could literally just say that, hey, I don't want to vote yet. As again, there is obviously this massive advantage to voting last, but this does lead to Theo being upset that they haven't voted yet, and this leads to this fun back and forth between the two. Though we do see them burning a vote on Jordan and Kaz, which feels weird that Tori let them burn a vote on Jordan. But either way, Jody and Benha, obviously, and Emily and Yes end up getting voted in, to which Emily and Yes were obviously going to be in the elimination, but we do end the episode with us getting to the elimination, where it turns out that Grant is now on crutches, where we have a Dick Bananas moment where he says, pick it up, man, when Grant comes out, which Grant just seems devastated during this. But again, obviously he gets DQ'd and Janae gets DQ'd with him, which ends up canceling the elimination, but ends up being a pretty sad way to see Grant and Janae go out here. Again, I'm not a big Grant fan. I think he does largely come off as entitled and isn't particularly likable, though I do like how he plays the game, as he is someone that is willing to make these big moves against these bigger players, and at least that's something. And ended up being a pretty solid competitor on this season alongside Janae, where Janae actually did surprise me on this season, where she once again just further proves that she is probably one of the best challenge competitors in the modern day, and with her not even getting properly eliminated from this season, she does end up still keeping her undefeated status, which to me keeps on elevating my overall estimations of her. Now for episode 7, where right away we get talk from Bananas and Justine about them getting stronger as a duo and declaring them just nanas, and all this felt like very obvious setup to them being in danger here. But beyond that, we do get some pretty great setup for this episode, which ends up being a relatively strong episode by the end of it. One that has us seeing the people on the bottom come together, where we see Jody and Benha, Kellyanne and Tristan promise to keep each other safe and talk about targeting Team USA. On the Team USA side of things, we see them still fractured, where we still see Ben not being trusted within them, while also we get set up to more of the Theo and Kaz relationship, which kind of ends up being tested by the end of the episode. With this all taking us into the daily, where it ends up being a really lame one, I will say. Again, one that for some reason only the global players end up playing in, where they end up having to race underneath these castle tunnels, counting up the number of flags that they see and then solve math questions using those. And this is just weird, as these end up being run in heats of 2, and usually the 2 that are in the heat together end up working together until the eventual puzzle. And like, all this was just kind of lame, especially because, again, it's fully on the global player, where I do feel like this would have been a lot better had each team been able to pick who does the task instead, or just do a normal daily that doesn't involve just one player. But by the way, out of nowhere, we end up getting Emily and Yes winning this daily, which did come out of left field to me, though we do have Jordan and Kaz losing due to Kaz timing out on the puzzle, which I'll also mention Benha also timed out on the puzzle, which supposedly the tiebreaker was who had the least amount of answers correct, which, okay, I guess, which once again just felt like production creating a tiebreaker rule on the fly. But though we'll say there were a couple fun moments from this daily, where again Kaz was just so terrible at math here, where she didn't even know what 7 times 6 was, and that was funny. We also have this awkward moment between Theo and Jody, where Theo makes like a sarcastic comment about Jody not trusting her partner, only for Jody to then talk about kicking him in the nuts, which was a funny moment. Either way, with Kaz and Jordan going to elimination, that obviously ends up being this very strong team that most people want out. Though right away we do see Tori and Bananas trying to get Team USA back together, to which no one within that alliance ends up trusting each other, which was really humorous, where you get this montage of Bananas not liking Danny and Sarah, Danny not trusting Bananas and Tori, Justine not trusting Ben, Ben not trusting Sarah. It really just goes all over the place. However, the plan ends up being to throw in Darrell and Kiki and Jody and Benha, with them now telling this to Kellyanne to try to secure the numbers, only for us to surprisingly see Kellyanne making a move, which, again, shocking, where this alliance from earlier actually comes together, where Kellyanne tells Jody and Benha, who then decide to pull in Darrell and Kiki, as they're obviously on the bottom as well. And we have those three putting their votes on Bananas and Justine, and Sarah and Theo being this pretty big flip in the game here. That was pretty fun to see. Again, surprised to see Darrell actually make a big move here, though again, that felt largely because he was kind of forced to. Though we are put in this position where Ben and Casey could have caused a stalemate if they wanted to, though in that situation they do obviously end up flipping, leading to this shocking result here where Bananas and Justine are pretty much guaranteed to go into elimination here, as Emily is never voting in Sarah. Again, this probably ends up being one of the more interesting gameplay moments across the season, but beyond this we get to elimination, where obviously Bananas and Justine are voted in, and the challenge itself is just kind of a lame one of recreating a pattern with barrels, and again, it wasn't particularly interesting, though we do see Jordan and Kaz winning here, with Bananas losing due to him using the wrong image of the sun, which everyone on the crowd seemed to know, which is humorous, as obviously they could have helped him out there, which they just decided not to. By the way, we do lose Bananas and Justine here, which Bananas having this downfall here was fun to see, to where despite Bananas having just recently come back from his hiatus, I feel like we've already gotten enough of Bananas. I think it was fun to see his downfall here, with him not coming off as particularly likable to me across this season. Again, I did feel like he was pretty condescending to a lot of the other players, which, I mean, to be fair, is just Bananas in general. But Justine here was fine. I mean, I feel like she was just more of the same from USA. Again, completely affable person on the show, not the most riveting TV in the world, though still someone I did feel like kind of got shortchanged on this season. I feel like she didn't really get much to really do on this season, but still a solid run nonetheless. Now for episode 8, which does end up being a bit of a strange episode here, particularly due to the beginning of it, where almost right away we do see that certain players are now sick, seemingly out of nowhere, and really the show never makes it clear how exactly these players all got sick, even though I'm pretty sure that information is online. Though we do see Amber, Ben, and Tristan each individually talk about being sick, with Amber in particular getting a lot of sympathetic content, talking about not wanting to let her partner down, but through Amber and Tristan in particular here, ends up leading to that alliance that formed in the previous episode to blindside Bananas, end up fracturing here, with two of those teams obviously now being weakened, which really starts this downward trajectory for that alliance, which is definitely a shame considering how impressive it was that they were able to stand back against these vets that we continuously see all the time in Bananas and Tori and Casey. But beyond that, Ben's sickness starts to take a major forefront, with him being taken away by medical, and through that eventually gets DQ'd from the game, with Casey's fate now being left up in the air. as we head into the daily, where here we do learn that Tristan was initially thinking about quitting due to his sickness, though ended up staying because of Kaz, which is ironic considering he later targets Kaz during the daily. But once we get to the daily, we do find out that Casey will be DQ'd from the game as well, alongside Ben, until Amber ends up revealing that she is also sick and reveals she is willing to swap her place with Casey, allowing Troy to continue on with Casey, creating a new pretty powerful pairing there, to which TJ allows it, aka the producers allow it, to where this leads to Amber leaving the show at this point, which was very abrupt. Again, we lose two players really out of nowhere in this episode, with it later being revealed that Amber left because she found out she was pregnant, which has somehow happened over and over and over again on the challenge. It's like, how's production not learned to just do pregnancy tests before the season to avoid possible liabilities? Like, it is so bizarre to me that this continues to happen, and it really just shows you how incompetent production is here. Before moving on, we might as well just talk about the booted players right away. So let's talk about Ben, who obviously had a very interesting run on this season. Again, it goes out in a whimper here where he just gets taken out of the blue, though he did play a major role before that. I did like his role in causing a lot of chaos within Team USA, and did like this brewing rivalry with Danny that I think could have led to a really interesting showdown down the road, that obviously it doesn't. Really, Ben's overall challenge career, though, is kind of depressing at this point, where he's been on 2 seasons, been medically DQ'd from both of them, despite him feeling like a pretty competent all-around competitor. And while I don't necessarily want to see Ben on the challenge again, if he were on, I mean, at least it's giving the guy his fair due and being able to at least finish one of his runs down the road. But also, let's talk about Amber, who leaves here, who didn't really have that much of a role on this season. I mean, she was kind of just there. And to be fair, that's really Amber on most challenge seasons, despite the fact that I really like Amber. I really want Amber to be this bigger character. It just feels like they never properly show her on the show, despite the fact that she constantly gets cast. And while she's probably going to be taking a break from this point forward, I do like Amber on the challenge, and I do feel like she typically has fun moments here and there, though this season in particular, it just felt like there wasn't that much for her to do. Well, now let's continue on with the episode, where we do see the daily, where it ends up being trivia. So they're hung on the top of a building, and when they get a question wrong, or when someone calls them out, they have to pull a rope from a series of ropes, with one of those leading to them being dropped, essentially making it a game of chance at that point, which makes this a daily that I didn't particularly like. I always thought it was pretty lame that you can literally just pull the wrong string right away and be DQ'd, or you could be given like 5 chances before being DQ'd. Like, it just kind of felt very arbitrary here, and did lead to some very underwhelming outcomes, where Jody and Benha end up going directly into elimination because both times they end up dropping right away, which is a lame way for them to go. Well, outside that, we did get some drama from Darrell and Kiki and Yes and Emily making a deal to target Troy and Casey due to their lack of trust in Casey, which was interesting to see. We also see Kellyanne and Tristan win here despite him being sick, which could have been this big shakeup in the power in the game, though sadly, because Jody and Benha are already going in, it just leads to the eventual elimination being between 2 of the teams that are on the bottom, which wasn't as interesting to see. Though we do get an interesting deliberation where Troy and Casey and Kiki and Darrell seem to be the 2 targets, though with Tori being Tori, she decides to not agree with Danny in throwing in Casey because they're friends, which is the entire issue with the modern landscape of the challenge. In a situation where even Jordan said screw it and voted in Casey, so it became even more frustrating to see Tori not voting Casey here, to the point where they end up voting for themselves over Casey, which is just even more ridiculous. Especially when we eventually see that leads to a tie, and in the tiebreaker, Tori is still unwilling to just vote in Casey when Casey's already going in anyway. Anyway, we get to the elimination where Troy and Casey are voted in due to, again, Casey not being trusted within that group, and through that we get a pretty boring elimination, one that is one of these standard memorization challenges where one of the partners sees the key and has to yell out the answer to the other person. Again, not super interesting, and we do see Troy and Casey easily win here, with the elimination of Jody and Benha, essentially meaning now that the entirety of Team Argentina is out of the game, which obviously ends up being this disappointing fate for them, with them again not really getting much of a chance here. But with that, let's talk about the booted players here in Benha and Jody, who end up being this fun underdog team here. I mean, in reality, were they the most riveting TV? Not really, but they were pretty likable here. Again, they never really seemed to have that much of a shot, considering just how big of a target the Argentinians had on their backs to begin with, though seeing him persevere through that and then almost flipping over the game with siding with Kellyanne and Tristan seemed to put them in the right direction, though they do kind of get unlucky in this boot round with how the overall daily played out. But beyond that, again, didn't really see them as true contenders to eventually win. But I did think they had a somewhat interesting storyline across this season, so at least there's that. Now for episode 9, where this episode is particularly slow one that really just solidifies this steamroll that ends up happening here, where you do get a lot of setup early on around this Danny and Tori conflict, with Danny wanting to keep Sarah and Emily around, while Tori wants to keep Jordan and Casey around. And through that, it essentially only leaves Darrell and Kiki and Kellyanne and Tristan as people that are not protected by them. So I wonder what's going to happen this episode. And we follow that up with Tristan talking to Kaz, talking about how they need to work together and showing Tristan rely on Kaz to survive this round, which I wonder what's going to happen here. So with that, along the fact that Kiki also gets a decent amount of personal content in early portions of this episode, it makes it very abundant what's going to happen. Falling into this typical challenge formula of really highlighting these players right before they're in danger of going home. But with that, we get to the daily, which is sponsored by Transformers Rise of the Beast, which I didn't even know there was a new Transformers movie. But we also awkwardly get this message from one of the actors in the movie, which was clearly not shown to the players, yet they try to pretend as if it was. But also, this daily ends up being really lame, and the show really hypes this up as one of these big action set pieces, but really all it is one of the players jumping a pretty small gap in between two moving trucks, only to then open a door in a truck, which will allow the other player to drive out of the truck in a car, to which all they literally have to do is just accelerate as quickly as possible. And it's just really boring. Like, just a really lame challenge here that they also hype it up at the end as, oh, it came down to seconds. Well, like, obviously, because this challenge doesn't take that long. And it also seemed really dangerous too, where we do see Emily and Tori both crashing. Just while they don't get injured, it definitely felt like a challenge prone to it. But here we do see Kiki and Darrell coming in last somehow. Again, not really explained, but through that, it becomes very clear that Kellyanne and Tristan are getting voted in because obviously, and we do spend a lot of time on this alliance coming together of Danny and Sarah working with Tori and Jordan, where they agree to vote in Kellyanne and Tristan this time, and then next time Sarah agrees to vote in Emily and Yes, to which she signs a contract over it, which was ridiculous. So also here we do technically need a pawn to be voted in, as obviously two teams have to be voted in, and while Jordan and Kaz had won the daily and are clearly just going to vote in Kellyanne and Tristan, they do need another team in there to which they'll vote to save, which they end up doing rock, paper, scissors to determine who goes in, which was really lame, even though really the answer should have been Danny and Tori anyway. As in that point, Jordan has much more of an excuse to be voting in Tristan and Kellyanne than if it had been literally anybody else. But here we do get some talk about Kaz's dilemma on voting in Tristan, but again, obviously we know where this is going to go. We do get some content from Kellyanne and Tristan during this, where it's Tristan's birthday, and we see Kellyanne giving him a muffin, which was random, and also we see Kellyanne like frantically campaigning like she did earlier in the season, which was kind of fun. But as a whole, just really boring setup to the elimination here, where obviously Kellyanne and Tristan are voted in, and the actual elimination itself ends up being really dull as well. It essentially being them having to transport puzzle pieces using chopsticks, then obviously solve the puzzle, which was just really mundane. Kiki and Darrell win. Kellyanne and Tristan are gone. Not that big of a surprise. But again, losing Kellyanne and Tristan here was a bit of a shame, especially in the fact that I do feel like they go out in a bit of a whimper here. It does feel like, despite them being these massive characters early on, I mean Kellyanne in particular, and them leading this vote against Bananas just a couple episodes ago, it felt like everything went wrong for them after that, to where all their alliance got picked off, to where here it really felt like there was nothing they could truly do. But again, I thought they both brought decent TV here. Kellyanne in particular obviously is one of the better characters of this entire season, which is a surprise considering she's obviously one of the biggest question marks of the legends that came back here. While Tristan was kind of bland. I mean, he was the same thing in Challenge UK, but at least here he had more of an underdog story that kind of made him a little bit more interesting. But even then, obviously Kellyanne is the more interesting one of the two, though their dynamic working together of them being essentially polar opposites was kind of interesting to see as well. But now for episode 10, another episode with a pretty mundane outcome, though one that had like some intrigue along the way, though that intrigue was also frustrating. But anyway, we obviously get the typical setup of Kiki and Darrell getting content early on, once again, with Darrell needing to talk about his kids, which is clear indication that he's probably going home here. Also, at the same time, we have Troy getting some content based around his relationship with Kiki, while also us getting content from Emily and Yes, with Sarah saying that Emily and Yes need to win the next daily, with Emily and Yes talking about how they're going to target Troy and Kiki. So I wonder how this is going to turn out. We get to the daily, which conveniently ends up being a swimming challenge, which you would think right away would greatly favor Emily, though they are also tethered together, which ends up leading to a bit of a disadvantage for her. But anyway, really boring challenge here, just swimming out, getting a puzzle piece, then coming back. Though we do get a level of intrigue here from Jordan and Kaz actually being in first, only for him to end up being a second too late because the fact that Jordan ended up picking up the wrong piece, which obviously ends up leading to Emily and Yes winning here. And once again, we do see Darrell and Kiki losing, which obviously just implies what was earlier set up. Though the path to that point ends up being a bit more rocky than expected, where we once again get this major highlight on the difference between the MVPs and the legends, with Sarah and Danny talking about playing strategically and not caring about friendships, while we see Jordan and Tori talking about wanting to protect Casey because of their relationship with her. To which this is what leads to all the frustration for me, and the fact that we do first focus on Jordan, who ends up promising to Casey that he won't vote her in, and talks about how the legends play with honor and they've built trust and loyalty through times they've played together, which really just highlights again the major issue with the challenge in casting the same people over and over again. But this leads to Jordan talking about how he wants to send himself into elimination instead of Casey, which 100% I don't fully buy into him actually doing this. This does end up leading to some fracturing in the relationship between Jordan and Kaz, where Kaz finally starts to step up to Jordan here, being upset that Jordan would be willing to throw them in, and Jordan just really came off as a dick across this entire episode, where we see them bickering in the confessional and even see them fighting in front of Theo, where you can clearly just tell how he had no regard for how Kaz was feeling in this situation, which is pretty apt for how Jordan typically acts. But also here, to add to the frustration, we also get Tori talking about how her friends have paid the debts of going into elimination and that it's now her turn. And here we have her going to Danny and telling him that she wants to throw themselves in, which is again just ridiculous. And again, just very much plays into Tori trying to look like a good person here by risking her game for her friends, which is just so annoying to watch at this point. By the way, we do get to the deliberation, where we do get both Kaz and Danny both being unwilling to let their partners throw them in. And while Jordan had previously talked about how he's willing to throw himself in, we do also get a flashback to a deal that he made with Emily and Yes to keep him safe, which makes all this come off extremely hypocritical in the fact that he talks about how he plays with honor and is willing to throw himself in, only for him to then make a deal to keep himself safe and then also make everyone agree here to cause a stalemate so that Emily and Yes will be the sole vote, which they know will cause Troy and Casey to be voted in because of his deal with Emily and Yes. Like, it is extremely hypocritical in this situation as well. But again, that is what we see happen. We see the two Australian champions being in the elimination together, with Emily being the one to send them in, which is humorous. But the actual elimination ends up being kind of a boring one of them swinging through these boards and solving these puzzles, and it wasn't close really at all, where Troy and Casey really just decimate this one, with Darrell and Kiki not even getting past the first puzzle, with it just feeling like a complete meltdown for them. But with that, obviously we lose Darrell and Kiki, who I continue to really like Kiki on the challenge. I really liked her on the challenge Australia, and now seeing her World Championship, I think she continues to be a really fun character, one that is this like scrappy underdog figure, one that is underestimated, one that I do think makes for better TV than some of the other rookies we've had in recent years. So Kiki is someone that I definitely want to see moving forward in the challenge as a mainstay on the main show, while Darrell is just kind of there. Again, I feel like we've seen so much of him recently, and mixing that in with his very passive gameplay style, he just isn't the greatest TV in my mind anymore. Again, he does bring some good one-liners here and there, but that's not really enough to fully cast him in my mind. Though technically for World Championship, I do think he's still a solid pick, as he is still obviously one of the bigger legends of the game, to where for a season of this caliber, it didn't make sense that he was here. Now we're episode 11, where right away we do get content about Casey wanting revenge on Emily and Yes, which makes it kind of obvious what's going to happen by the end of the episode. But to go along with that, we do get more details on the deal that Emily and Yes made with Jordan and Kaz, a deal that has Jordan and Kaz throwing the next daily, which, I mean, with most people, I mean, this is a ridiculous deal that most people won't follow through with, but again, we're talking about Jordan. This is where we do get more focus on the Jordan-Kaz relationship, with Kaz being upset at him being patronizing. It's like, again, this is just so boring. Now, obviously, it does play into the overall outcome of the season, but it's still, like, not the most interesting content in the world. We follow that up with Sarah finally getting personal content, talking about her family back at home, along with the fact that she's bonded with Danny since their original season, and that mixed in with the fact that Theo also gets a random confessional talking about wanting to win the challenge. Again, it's like, I wonder what's going to happen at the daily. But it ends up being a daily that has this big swimming component at the beginning, but also adds in these social strategy aspects of when finishing the first leg, you get to drop another team until there's only 2 teams left. And here we obviously see Emily winning the swimming section and end up eliminating Casey and Troy, fully fitting into that story, though right after that, we see Emily and Yes drop, to which we get the reveal that it was Jordan that did so, with him saying that his deal was to throw the daily, not necessarily to stop them from winning the daily, which, and this just feeling like the most Jordan thing ever, of going against the people he made a deal with, but then using the specific wording of it to find a way out of it. Again, not faulting him for going against the deal, more so faulting him for still acting like he's going through with the deal when he is still going after Emily and Yaz. Either way, it comes down to Sarah and Theo versus Jordan and Kaz in a puzzle, to which Jordan just throws it, telling Kaz to not even try. And again, this is him trying to follow through with his deal, which is like, who cares at this point? If you win this daily, you're at the final anyway. But again, this was pretty ridiculous here to just see Jordan just telling Sarah and Theo the answer, essentially just handing them the win. Again, it would have been hilarious if this backfired on Jordan. I really wish that happened, though sadly it doesn't. But Sarah and Theo winning here does put them in a pretty tough spot at this point, where again, we're down to the point where all these people's closest allies are still left in the game. I mean, with C and Troy in elimination, that only leaves Kaz and Jordan, who which Theo will not put in due to Kaz, and then Danny and Tori and Emily and Yes, with Sarah obviously wanting to protect both of them. And this all ends up leading up to content based around who's Sarah gonna pick between Danny and Emily. But then we get this awkward moment of her telling Emily that she's going in, but they did so without cameras on them, so we get footage of outside the room as we hear their audio, which is just kind of weird. But either way, we have Jordan being Jordan and getting everyone to agree to do a stalemate, to which that leads to more bickering content between Tori and Jordan, which is like, who cares? But anyway, we get to the elimination where for some reason they decide to change up the stalemate rules because that's the challenge for you. And instead of Sarah and Theo being able to vote in whoever they want, they decide to give the power to Casey and Troy, who should have had the power to begin with. Again, like, I feel like that was the better format anyway, to give the eliminee the sole vote over the daily winner. But they obviously end up picking Emily and Yes. Who would have guessed? And we do get Hall Brawl as the elimination here, which was pretty exciting. Though at the same time, I feel like it came off kind of underwhelming, where nothing of that note really happens here. I mean, Troy does beat Yes, which I guess is a bit of a surprise considering he is a smaller guy. But we have Emily beating Casey the first time around, only for the tiebreaker to be a rematch between Emily and Casey, to where Casey beats her the second time. But anyway, the episode does end with the reveal that they're starting the final right away, which they try to act as if it's a surprise, despite many other versions of the show doing this at this point, including some of the seasons that these people come from. So I don't know why this is that big of a shock. But with that, we do obviously lose Emily and Yes. And I think there's a pretty big disparity between the impact that these players had on their seasons, where these players had on the season where Yes was just there. I mean, didn't really bring too much to the table. I don't even think I could tell you a single individual Yes moment across this season. And again, Yes is a very likable guy, but just not the most riveting TV. Though again, for a season like this, I do think he is a solid casting pick as the winner of the original Challenge All-Stars. I feel like that is something to give credit to. While Emily was probably one of the more questionable picks on the board here. Obviously someone that barely made it past the halfway point on the Challenge Australia, though obviously he's an Olympic swimmer. And again, she did prove herself physically here. She did win a couple dailies, was very good at swimming challenges, obviously. Played very hard, now I will say. Questionable decision making at points, especially in her very openly just isolating Kiki and Troy and getting them to go against them. That's really bad. Though at the same time, she built a very strong relationship with Sarah, to where the only point where Sarah was willing to let her go was when it was between Emily and Danny, who she had a pre-existing relationship. And I will say, like, I feel like by the end of this season, I kind of liked Emily as this like villainous figure for the show. I don't necessarily find her to be the most likable person in the world, but I do think she's a bit of a chaotic player in a way that I wouldn't be that opposed to see her on the challenge again down the road. But with that, let's get into the finale, which I will say I found to be mostly lame. I really did not find this to be an interesting finale, really at all. I mean, I felt like the overall structuring of the challenges was just kind of bland and really just underwhelming for the conclusion to a world championship season, a season that's supposed to be declaring the best of the best. But we do start off with the players at a train station for some reason to where they board the Fear Express, which just felt very random. Anyway, we get the first part of the final, which is them running 16 miles and completing checkpoints, which was really boring. But instead we do see Sarah and Theo struggling, with Theo getting content about how he's the only one here missing out on a win, which I will say that did kind of surprise me. I didn't even realize that fact that literally everyone in the final here outside Theo had won a previous season, which again adds some pedigree to the competition on this season. But here we do end up seeing Theo roll his ankle, to which this completely slows him and Sarah down to the point where they get lapped by Kaz and Jordan. And obviously all leading up to Theo having to quit the final, which I will say I did feel bad for him here in the sense that you could tell that he wanted to prove himself against this really tough field, and for him to be the first out here from this really random incident just kind of sucks. And Sarah going alongside him was a very underwhelming end to her season, but obviously with that we do lose Sarah and Theo, who sadly weren't that prominent as a pair on this season. Obviously Sarah got a decent amount of content, particularly due to her anti-returnee status and her relationships with Danny and Emily. However, I feel like Theo really just didn't get much on the show, which I do think is a shame considering how excited I was to see him back on the challenge, though unlike certain people that talk about never wanting to see him again after this, I feel like I'm still personally okay with seeing him get another chance. I do feel like Theo still has potential to make good TV and is still a pretty solid competitor to where I still wouldn't be opposed to seeing him again, even though this season was certainly an underwhelming one for him. But continuing on to the final, we do see Jordan and Kaz in the lead for really the majority of the run. While coming into the final checkpoint, Danny and Tori were in second. They'll have to wait for Jordan and Kaz to finish their checkpoint before they can do theirs, considering they both saved the smoothies for last, which again through that we do get more puking, which yay. But that ends up leading to Troy and Casey passing them at the last second, which I mean, to be fair, none of this really matters too much, which is the even more disappointing aspect of all this is the fact that it really just felt like this was here just to tire out the players, not really because it had any true ramifications on the later parts of the final, where the only effect of your placement here is it affects how much time you get to sleep later on, with that being an hour for first place, 30 minutes for second place, and 15 minutes for third place, which is again not much at all anyway, and barely any difference. So it does kind of feel like all this is just kind of just there to torture the players, with it not having that major of ramifications on the actual results, and not really giving that much of a benefit for coming in first. But either way, we have the players then getting back on the train to where we get this really weird segment of TJ offering one player from each pair IVs, which just really felt out of left field and doesn't really play a factor into anything, as it's just really this throwaway scene here. But then after that, they get taken to the luxury liner where they're given food to eat and weird evening wear, only for TJ to come in and telling them that they must now stay awake for the entire night, where they're going to be placing shock collars around their necks, which again, we never see anyone actually get shocked, so I assume this is purely for aesthetics and make it seem like this was more dangerous than what it really was. Anyway, we get to the final leg itself, which was also really boring. It essentially just being a bike ride followed by a hike up a mountain, then you do a slide puzzle and then run back down. Again, it was just so boring and so lame as the final leg of a world championship. And really here we don't get that much intrigue either, where initially Troy and Casey are in the lead. However, Casey seems to completely break down to the point where Troy is the carrier on his back, which I will say probably not the greatest sign for Casey's overall final ability, though we do see Kaz and Jordan staying in the lead from that point on. And while you do see them get in an argument over the puzzle, they still remain in first and just kind of anticlimactically win here. And also very rushed, as like within the last minute of the episode, we see Danny and Tori coming in second and Troy and Casey coming in third. I do find it funny that one of the last confessions that we end up getting is from Danny talking about how he should have gotten rid of Jordan earlier in the season, which is a really nice payoff to that storyline. Obviously kind of proving Danny right in the fact that they should have gone for Jordan, with Jordan being such a clear person to win if he got to a final. Again, showing Danny caring about the long game of this specific game, while Tori is obviously more focused on the long game in terms of her entire challenge career. But anyway, with that, let's start talking about the final 3 teams before ending the video. Starting off with Casey and Troy, who obviously were a pair that came together midway through the season, though, again, they were fine. I mean, again, I've been very outspoken the fact that I think Casey's really boring and I don't need to see her on reality TV anymore. And to be fair, Troy isn't particularly interesting either, though I did think them together kind of made for this likable underdog team, especially with the fact that they were constantly being thrown to eliminations. And again, Casey herself has a pretty decent elimination run here, again, winning 4 eliminations on this season, with Troy winning 3. Again, they were this pretty rootable underdog team, though coming into the final, I did feel like they felt outmatched. And while to be fair, again, they were outperforming Danny and Tori throughout many points of this final, I did feel against Kaz and Jordan, it didn't feel like they would come anywhere close there. But again, while Casey was probably a little bit more entertaining on this season, I would still say, still don't need to see Casey back personally. And Troy is someone that I could take or leave. Again, I think he's a likable person, someone that is a very strong competitor, but someone that just doesn't make for the most riveting TV. So casting him would just kind of be a wash for me. And then to move on to the second place team, and Danny and Tori, who had this interesting dynamic across the season, obviously them being the 2 teammates that were on the complete polar opposite ends of things, with Danny obviously wanting to play against the vets and play this more strategic game, while Tori was all about loyalty and sticking to her friends. I think that dynamic made this relationship here really interesting, even though again it was kind of frustrating to watch, especially from Tori's end. Tori, again, obviously I personally do enjoy more of the Danny style of play, this more aggressive play where you're trying to get the win, taking out the threats like Jordan and Kaz before the end. And I think it just further emphasizes why I don't like Tori Deal as a TV character, and the fact that she's just boring and makes the game boring. Again, no fault of her as a player. I think at the end of the day, again, while I obviously have strategic issues with the fact that she wanted to throw herself in at points, I do very much understand the sentiment of wanting to keep close to your friends and keep these relationships for future seasons. However, again, it just makes for boring TV to where, why are we casting these people? I think at the end of the day, this season made me even more frustrated the current state of the challenge in terms of the continuous casting of Tori Deal, while Danny felt like a bit of fresh air. I feel like coming out of USA and even Survivor, I felt like he was largely fine. However, coming to World Championship, being pretty high on Danny, to where I definitely would like to see him again down the road. But finally, let's talk about the winners in Jordan and Kaz, who were clearly going to win by the time of this final. I mean, I feel like Jordan is very clearly one of the best final competitors in challenge history, and if he has a competent partner that isn't Anissa, I feel like Jordan is a very likely winner every time he gets to a final. Though Jordan is another one that, again, I don't find that entertaining anymore. I feel like Jordan is kind of mellowed out to a degree, at least in terms of his cockiness and his rashness that used to get him in trouble, but it still kind of remained a dick. I didn't like the way he treated Kaz on this season, and considering his similar philosophy to Tori of trying to keep with your friends and playing with honor, it just leads him, again, just not being that interesting a TV. Now, again, for any legend season, and again, for a season like World Championship in particular, it makes a lot of sense for him to be here, obviously. He is one of the biggest names in the history of the challenge. But I do think for seasons down the road, I'm kind of just fine not having Jordan back for a while, and we did get him on 3 seasons, all within a year, which definitely felt like a lot. But then for Kaz, I will say I ended up being a bit disappointed with Kaz in her challenge career. Now, I'm someone that does follow challenge spoilers, and through that, even before Challenge UK even aired, I knew that she was the winner of both UK and World Championship, and considering some talk online about her, I was very much expecting her to be this next big star for the challenge, this player that can be both entertaining but also a really strong competitor. And I feel like she kind of underwhelmed me on both fronts. As a character, she was not particularly interesting, probably just being a slightly better version than Casey, but even then still relented to Jordan at many opportunities, though to be fair, it is Jordan. Well, competition wise, again, she barely wins her final in UK, and even here it did feel like she was very much struggling at multiple points across this season. And I just kind of come out of it a bit underwhelmed. Now, I personally wouldn't mind seeing her on a future season. I still think she's still a better casting choice than certain other vets that we've continuously seen over and over again. But I did find her role on this season to be kind of underwhelming as newly declared world champion. But anyway, with that, that is the entire season of the Challenge World Championship. A season that, again, I just come out of just being fine with. Again, there were ups and downs. I feel like there was this really good stretch in the middle, particularly around the time of the Bananas elimination. However, then there were really slow points. But in comparison to Modern Challenge, I still think this was a solid season. I mean, Modern Challenge has been just kind of bad recently. I mean, ever since all the madness, I feel like the main series has not been particularly particularly great. And when we're going to the spin-offs, I feel like this is probably on par with something like an All-Stars 3. It's like largely just fine seasons through and through. They have a couple sprinkles of good moments here and there. Again, it's not as good as something like an All-Stars 2 in my mind, even the Challenge Australia, but I still feel like it's a solid enough season for what it is. But what it is still, again, largely underwhelming for a season dubbed the World Championship, where again you would have expected a grander scale season and determine the best of the best, but instead it just ends up being kind of on par with an all-star season. Anyway, with that, those are my thoughts on the Challenge World Championship. Now moving forward, I'll be covering future Challenge seasons, All-Stars 4, USA 2, Challenge 39. I'm assuming we're going to get a cast of that somewhat soon, to where I'll probably do a cast reaction. Also down the road, a video that I've been talking about doing for a while now is doing a spin-off ranking for the Challenge, which I still plan on doing that. And initially I was going to do it after World Championship, though now with the fact that we obviously know that All-Stars 4 and USA 2 are coming more than likely by the end of the year, I feel like I might as well just wait for those to finish and do it at the end of the year. So stay tuned for that down the road as well. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.